In this video, we're going to take our newly hooked up Redux React Native application, and we're going to basically test to make sure that we can trigger actions, we can view them in the logger, and we can make changes in our store or in our reducers. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create another container component. So in the last video, I created this constant app function, which has a provider component, and this is a component that is provided by React and Redux. And I use that to wrap Peckish, which was the default component that was created by React Native. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete this whole thing. And we're going to create our own container component. We're going to call this app container. So because we're not using any of that code anymore, we can actually delete Peckish, and we're going to replace it with our own app container, which also means that I can delete React Native entirely here. And in fact, we're not going to be using React Native at all in this class or in this file. So this file has now become, actually, no, that's not true. We're still going to need the app registry. My mistake. We don't need the style sheet, we don't need the text, and we don't need the view object. Okay. So we have our store. This file just does one thing. It basically wraps our app container with our store, and it passes in, or it runs the app container. Now the app container, again, this is a very simple application. In most cases, you would probably store your tabs or any kind of navigation in the overall app container. And then from there, inside of that component, you would have the different pages of your application, your home, your settings page, your details page, whatever. In our case, it's going to be sort of single components all the way down, but hopefully the tree won't be too deep. So we've got our app container component. Now if I refresh this by doing Command R, it's going to say it's not defined, which we knew. And so we have to define it. So I'm going to import app container from app containers app container. So this is going to be a class of, actually we'll do class app container extends component. And we will import component from React. And that should be pretty good. Of course, we're going to need a render method. And I'm going to return a view. The view is like a div, basically. It's the equivalent of a div. And we will just have a margin top of 20. This will just keep it from butting up against the status bar. And we'll say I am app container. Very exciting. Okay. And then I will export default app container down here. Of course, we're going to need to import from React Native. And this is going to look, we need to, of course, define React Native. And we want the view, and we want the text. There are a number of different components, but we just need to import the ones we need for this particular file. Refresh this again. Unexpected token on line 6. Oh, this is not an import, this is a constant. Okay, so here we go, we've got app container. Now, let's get the last little piece of wiring in place for Redux. Instead of doing export default app container and bringing that in, we're actually going to use another Redux piece of magic. And in this case, that's going to be to hook up all of the actions we might have in our application to our app container. And this allows us to trigger actions from any of the components down the line. So let's do import connect from React Redux. This is a very simple method that will take in the state and the actions and will wrap whatever component we give it. And we are also going to import action creators from actions. Now you might remember we actually did a very preliminary description of what an action creator was in a previous video, but we'll go through that in just a moment. So we have import action creators from actions, and now we are going to change this code at the bottom. We're going to create our own function here called map dispatch to props. It will take in a method or an argument called dispatch, and this is a special function that is used for dispatching actions, essentially sending actions to the entire application. And this is a little bit of boilerplate, but we basically run bind action creators. We pass in action creators and the dispatch method. This is a pattern you'll see often in a Redux application. And these are quote-unquote smart components because they are components that are connected to the actions and the store of the application. And instead of doing export default app container just like this, we'll do export default, and then we'll actually connect. And for now, the store will remain empty. The first argument is a function for manipulating the store. In this case, it'll be empty. And we will connect it to another function, which is map dispatch to props. And I misspelled that, and we'll pass in the app container. So basically, connect takes in two functions. This function is not doing anything. It's just basically not taking or listening for arguments, and it's just returning an empty object. And then the second function, which does map dispatch to props, it takes in the dispatch, and it basically takes all of the action creators that we have in our application, and it passes in dispatch. So this gives us a way of centrally dispatching actions throughout the entire application. And then connect wires all of that up. So we now have action creators up here. Again, if this seems a little bit obtuse or overwhelming, when you're building Redux applications, you typically don't touch this stuff very often. You usually do this for your containers, and then the rest of the components are very much simple React code. And it's all pretty straightforward down the line. So that's why I refer to this as boilerplate. Now here we've got import action creators. If we look at actions index, we've already defined action creators, and it's pulling them in from recipe actions. And then if we went to recipes.js, it was actually an empty file. So far, so good, not too exciting. And now I want to put together a very simple example. So I'm just going to refresh this, make sure the app is still functioning, which it's not. It says that bind action creators doesn't exist. So let's figure out why it doesn't exist. Go back to app container. Bind action creators is here. Oh, I think I forgot an import. So bind action creators from Redux. Refresh this again, and so far so good. All right. Now let's create our first action in the application. For the purposes of doing a round trip, I'm going to start with a very simple example. This is just straight up React, no Redux, very, very bog standard, right? So let's just do recipe count And then we'll do this dot state dot recipe count, right? And we'll have a constructor here, which will take in props. And the initial state for recipe count will be 0. And then I'm going to have a button, which in React Native land is a touchable highlight. Which will say touchable highlight on press. And it will increment recipe count. So that's our button that says add recipe. The last thing is we need to create a function here called increment recipe count, which will do this dot set state, and it will take this dot, it will take recipe count, it will do this dot state dot recipe count, and increment it by 1. And we'll just refresh this. Always important to call super our constructors. Now when I press this button, it increases the recipe count. So that's great. Now the problem with this code is that it's localized to just this component. So in order to fix that, we're going to start looking at the Flux architecture. Now instead of just doing increment recipe count and getting that as local state in the component, we are going to grab that as props that will be passed in through Redux. So instead here, I'm going to create an action under recipes, and I'm going to export function increment, or actually I'll just say add recipe. And it will return a very simple payload. I'm just going to say add recipe. We haven't defined this yet. But I'm just going to say, okay, there's this action that's of type add recipe. And let's say that the recipe itself has something in it. Actually, let's just keep it really simple. It's just a simple message saying add recipe. And we will import star as types from type. We'll go to our types, and we'll create a new constant here called add recipe. And we define these in a separate file because this add recipe description, this constant, is actually going to appear in the reducer as well. It's going to be essentially a message that we will see in our logging and elsewhere. So I want this message to fire in my app container. So instead of doing increment recipe count here, I'm going to create a new method called add recipe. And here I'm going to do this dot props dot add recipe. Now, you'll notice that this dot props, I haven't actually described this anywhere. And the reason that it's coming in at all is because the action creators and this connect method are all being pulled in to this app container component and making those functions accessible as actions in my application. So now when I refresh this again, and we open up our logging, when I press add recipe, you can see that all of a sudden, the logger middleware is now sending an action called add recipe. And we've already described searched recipes as an element of our reducer. And so we can see that as well. Of course, all of this is empty right now, so it's not very interesting. But this gives us a hint into how we can see each step of our state changing. To complete this example, we're going to go to our reducer for a moment. So if we go back to our recipes reducer, I'm going to create a new reducer called recipe count, and its default value is going to be 0. And I'm going to refresh this again. And when I add recipe, you'll see that recipe count is now 0. The next step is to actually listen for this message. And so I'm going to go to types.addRecipe, and I take in the state and the action. And remember what I said about how we transform the state, right? There is no store per se, it's just a series of transformations of our state. So we listen for the transformation of add recipe, and then we modify our state accordingly. So one modification would be to just return the state again, which would mean to return 0. Another would be to return the state plus add 10. So now if I refresh this again, it explodes on me. Why is it exploding on me? I actually don't need those arrows. Refresh that again. And now when I add recipe, I can see that my recipe count is actually going up by 10, and then 20, and then 30, and then 40, and so on and so forth. So because my state is described as just being a number here, I should just have to say recipe, on add recipe, just do state plus plus. Now if I refresh this again, it's actually just returning 0 each time. Just do that again. And now it's actually working. And this brings up an interesting point, which is that every time you return state, you're actually returning a new object. Everything else is destroyed. And so you can't just take a reference to an object and then modify it. You actually have to return a new object. And this is an important concept in immutable data structures that you would have in Redux. And this is why people use things like immutable.js with Redux. Now, for the purposes of this example, I've kept it relatively straightforward, but you can see very quickly how you can modify the state, and you can have some good debugging. And this is, of course, centralized to a series of actions. Now, if we go back to our app container here, we've got our add recipe method here. And then instead of going to this.state.recipe count here, we could actually work with the state in this example. And so, as I mentioned before, when we're connecting things up here, we can connect the actions, which you see here, but we can also connect the state. And this is where the Redux secret sauce comes in. So in the same way that I am mapping the dispatch to props for the actions, I can also map portions of the state. And I can say that the recipe count is coming from the recipe count. So this state object here that's being passed in as an argument is actually the global state of the application. And so now we can delete this method, we can delete this method, and I should be able to, in theory, just grab the recipe count from props. If I refresh this again, you can see that the recipe count is incrementing. And this is global, right? This is happening throughout the entire application, and I can see every single state change from my debugging console. Which also means that we can clean this up even further, we can delete this constructor, and we end up with a function, or actually a component that's very, very simple and very easy to reason about because there's no side effects. You know, you fire an action and there's your value. And so all of the transformation is happening in the other portions of the application that are dedicated to mutating state. In the next video, we're going to clean this up a little bit, and we're going to start looking at how we can build out a home component, and then ultimately the asynchronous aspects of our application. Thanks for listening.